Warren Kessler set his scotch down on the white tablecloth and said it loud enough for the whole table to hear. She married him for the money, not the man. Nobody laughed right away. His golf partners did, a beat later, the way people laugh when they're not sure if they're allowed to. My husband's hand went still around his fork. His mother found something urgent to study in the folds of her napkin. I set my wine glass down. No clink. No sound at all. My name is Mara Kessler. I'm 36 years old, and for 14 years I've made my living reading people who lie for a living. Claims examiners call it pattern recognition, but really it's just knowing the exact half-second a person's face stops matching their words. Warren has never been good at lying. He's good at volume. Those aren't the same skill, and by the end of that dinner, everyone at that table would understand the difference. By the time dessert was supposed to arrive, my father-in-law would be standing outside under the Brindlewood Country Club's awning, being asked, quietly, by the event manager, to wait for his car. Not because I raised my voice. Not because I said a single cruel word to him in front of his friends. The valet had already brought my car around before that happened, engine idling, my purse already on the passenger seat, like some part of me had known for weeks exactly how that night would end. But to understand why I didn't flinch when he said it, you have to go back 4 months, to a warehouse fire that was never supposed to have my name attached to it at all. Welcome back to Calm Destruction Stories. This one's about a specific kind of lonely being underestimated by people who share your last name, who sat across from you at every holiday, and somehow never actually looked at you. If you've ever had a relative who said something like Warren's, in that same easy, certain tone, I'd love to know. Tell me where you're watching from tonight, and whose voice you heard when you read his line. Now let me take you back to where this actually started, not at the club, but at my desk, on an ordinary Tuesday, 4 months before any of that. I've worked special investigations for Meridian Mutual for 9 years now, in the division that exists for one reason: to catch the claims that shouldn't get paid before a check ever leaves the building. Most people don't know that division exists until they need it, and by then it's usually too late for whoever filed the claim. I caught a water damage case 2 years ago that still gets mentioned in training sessions. $60,000, a burst pipe in a finished basement, photos of warped flooring and soaked drywall, submitted right on schedule. Everything matched except one windowsill in the corner of the third photo, where a half-inch of undisturbed dust sat exactly where it would have sat for months. Water doesn't rise around a room and leave dust untouched on a ledge 4 feet up. The homeowner had staged the flood with a garden hose and forgotten about the sill. I flagged it, wrote it up, and the claim never made it past my desk. I don't raise my voice in meetings. I've never needed to. I ask one more question than people expect, and I wait through the silence after it, instead of filling it for them. My coworkers call me the closer, half as a joke, because the files I flag don't end up contested in court. They end up closed, quietly, the way most true things eventually get to be, once someone finally looks at them straight on. None of that has ever meant much to Warren. At every Kessler family dinner, every holiday, every anniversary, business talk goes straight to Nate. Questions about margins, about the fabrication shop's new contracts, about whatever Warren's newest plan for the company happens to be. My job gets a polite nod and a change of subject, like, Warren's still waiting for me to grow out of it, the way you'd wait out a phase in a teenager. 14 years in insurance investigation, and to my father-in-law, I still might as well be filing paperwork for fun. That hobby was about to collide with the Kessler family business in a way nobody sitting at that table would ever have seen coming. 3 Thanksgivings ago, Warren stood at the head of Elaine's dining table, raised his glass, and toasted the ones who actually built something. His eyes moved from Nate to his old business partner Frank, to the framed photo of the original machine shop on the wall behind him. 1 lathe, 1 bay door, 1988 stenciled under the glass, and never once landed on me. I was sitting 3 feet from him, holding a bowl of stuffing I'd made from scratch. He didn't skip me on purpose. That was the thing. He didn't have to. Kessler Fabrication started as that single machine shop and grew, over 30-some years, into a company with 2 warehouses and a payroll of 90-some people. Elaine likes to joke, and it's always framed as a joke, light and quick, the way families do with things that aren't funny at all, that she keeps a running tally in her head of who shows up for that company. Who comes to the Christmas party? Who asks about the new contracts? Who, in her words, actually cares if this thing survives? I've learned a family runs on a ledger, and it isn't Elaine's little joke about showing up. It's about who gets forgiven. When Nate lost $80,000 trying to run a satellite fabrication shop out in Dunmore 2 years into our marriage, it was absorbed into the family story so completely that I've heard Warren tell people Nate took a smart pause before doubling down. Nobody brings it up. Nobody has to. But when I was laid off twice in 3 years from my old firm, before Meridian ever hired me, Warren told Elaine loud enough for me to hear from the next room that I seemed unstable. Same category of event. Different last name attached to it. There's a second rule I learned slower because it never gets said outright. Every anniversary, every holiday, I feel myself get quietly re-audited. Am I still worth being Nate's wife this year? Did I contribute enough, defer enough, smile through enough of Warren's jokes at my expense to keep my seat at that table for another 12 months? Nobody hands you the results. You just feel whether you passed. Warren built all of it, the shop, the ledger, the audits, and somewhere along the way he started mistaking control for love, the same way some men mistake being obeyed for being respected. In 9 years of marriage into this family, I have never once heard him apologize for anything, not to Elaine, not to Nate, not to me, not in front of a single witness. So I stopped correcting him. Years ago. Not because he was right, but because correcting him always cost me more than it ever cost him. An evening ruined, a silence at Christmas, some new proof for Elaine's tally that I was the difficult one. Silence was cheaper. I told myself that for a long time. That silence is exactly what let the first real betrayal walk right past me. 18 months before that dinner at Brindlewood, I lost a pregnancy for the second time in 3 years, in the 10th week, on a Sunday morning, while Nate was at the pharmacy picking up a prescription I never ended up needing. 6 weeks after that, the distributor Nate had worked for since college eliminated his entire regional sales division in a single email sent at 4:40 on a Friday afternoon. We told his parents over dinner that we'd need to move in with them for a few months, just until Nate found something, and we could rebuild what the layoff had taken out of our savings. I remember exactly how the kitchen smelled that night, rosemary, from the chicken Elaine had made, and I remember thinking, foolishly, that grief and bad luck might finally be enough to soften the room. Warren set his fork down and said, "Well, someone in this house needs to be bringing in real money." He was looking at me when he said it. I was the one still employed. I was the one who hadn't missed a single paycheck through any of it, who'd gone back to work at Meridian 11 days after the miscarriage, because bereavement leave for a loss like mine runs out fast and quiet, in a way nobody explains to you beforehand. Nate was the one between jobs. But Warren's eyes went to me, not his son, the same way they always seem to land wherever the fault is easiest to place. Priya, across the table, suddenly needed both hands to refill her water glass. Elaine studied the chicken like it required close inspection. Nobody corrected him. I didn't correct him either. Because in this family, a job loss is a circumstance if you're born a Kessler, and a liability if you married in. Nate's layoff would get folded into the family story, the same way his Dunmore shop had a rough patch, weathered together. Mine would just be one more entry in a ledger nobody ever showed me, proof that I was somehow the reason for whatever was going wrong. I got up when dinner ended and started clearing plates, stacking them the way I always do, silverware tucked inside so nothing clatters in the sink. Elaine helped. Priya helped. Nate carried the serving dish in without being asked. Warren stayed at the table, refilling his water glass from the pitcher, watching the four of us move around him like weather he didn't need to step outside for. He didn't carry a single dish that night. Not one. I noticed, the way I notice everything, and I said nothing, because saying something had never once made a Kessler dinner end any differently. That quiet arithmetic, what gets forgiven, what gets counted against you, was nothing compared to the number I'd find myself accidentally auditing 7 months later. 7 months after that dinner, one of Kessler Fabrication's 2 warehouses caught fire. Nobody was hurt. That mattered more to me than anything else in the whole business, and I said so, and meant it. But the equipment loss was significant, the inventory loss worse, and for a week or two the family talked about little else. Kessler Fabrication isn't insured through Meridian Mutual. I had no professional reason to be anywhere near that claim, and I told myself that clearly, the way you tell yourself something you already suspect isn't going to hold. A courier mixed up an address on a Wednesday afternoon and left a duplicate claims packet on my front step instead of at the Kessler Fabrication office 3 miles away. I only opened it because the label had Nate's name on it, and I assumed, reasonably, that it was something he needed to sign. It wasn't addressed to him to sign. It was already signed. I stood in my kitchen with the packet open on the counter, coffee going cold beside it, reading an ownership transfer authorization that released Nate's minority stake in the warehouse property over to Warren, in light of financial hardship. Nate's signature sat at the bottom of the page, his full name, his usual loop on the K, except it wasn't his usual loop. The K curved the wrong way, tight and closed at the top where Nate always leaves it open, like a habit worn into muscle memory over 30-some years of writing his own name. I know what a real signature looks like under pressure, under haste, under a dozen different pens. This wasn't that. This was someone doing their best impression of Nate in a hurry. If you've ever looked at a signature and felt that little snag in your stomach like something about the shape of the letters was wrong, before your brain had even caught up to why, comment below, because that's exactly the feeling I had, standing in my own kitchen, coffee going cold, staring at my husband's name written by someone who almost got it right. Nate had said nothing to me about signing away any part of his stake in that warehouse. Nothing about financial hardship, nothing about a transfer, nothing at all. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't call Warren. I took out my phone, photographed the signature page under the kitchen light so the ink strokes were clear, and photographed the 2 pages around it for context, then slid the packet back into its envelope exactly the way it had arrived. The next morning I drove it to the Kessler fabrication office myself, told the receptionist there had been a courier mix-up, and handed it over like it was nothing at all. Nobody thanked me for going out of my way. Nobody asked why I'd opened it in the first place. I didn't offer an explanation, and I didn't need one. I'd already gotten what I came for. That photograph sat untouched in my phone for weeks, filed away in the same quiet place I keep everything I've decided not to look at yet. It would have stayed there indefinitely, I think, if the third injustice hadn't made looking away completely impossible. 3 weeks later, Warren stood at the grill at the annual company barbecue, flipping burgers for a crowd of employees and family alike, and announced it the way he announces everything, like it had already been decided, and the rest of us were simply being informed. "I've simplified the ownership structure ahead of retirement," he said, not looking up from the spatula. Nate's stake got folded back into mine, for tax reasons. He's on board with it. Nate's beer stopped halfway to his mouth. "Dad, we talked about this," Warren said, already turning to greet one of the board members walking up with a plate. The conversation moved on around him the way water moves around a rock, like Nate hadn't spoken at all. Priya, standing beside me, asked loudly whether anyone had tried the corn, and just like that the subject changed, smooth and practiced, the exact way it always changes in this family. I understood, watching her do it, that keeping the peace is its own kind of survival skill, one Priya had clearly been perfecting since long before I ever married into this family. This wasn't a slight over dinner plates or a comment about who's bringing in real money. This was procedural. Public. It touched the actual structure of a company that was supposed to be Nate's eventual security, our eventual security, the thing we'd assumed, however naively, would be there under us if everything else in our life kept going sideways the way it had the past 3 years. I was still holding a plastic cup of lemonade, saying nothing, when Esteban Ruiz stepped up beside the drink cooler and started fishing through the ice for a soda he clearly didn't need yet. Esteban has worked the warehouse floor at Kessler Fabrication for 22 years. He's the kind of quiet, steady presence a company like that runs on and rarely thanks properly. 2 years ago, when his daughter's medical claim got denied over a coding error, nobody at his insurer would explain to him in plain English. I'd spent one Saturday afternoon on the phone walking him through exactly what to appeal and how to phrase it. It cost me nothing. He'd remembered it for 2 years. He didn't look at me while he talked, just kept sorting through the ice like he was hunting for the last root beer. "Asked to see the actual claim file," he said, low enough that only I could hear it over the noise of the grill. "Not the summary. The actual file." I asked him what he meant. "Warren doesn't know I know you work in insurance," he said. That was all. He cracked open a can, nodded once toward the house like he had someplace to be, and walked off toward the folding tables without another word. I stood by that cooler for a long moment after he left, watching Warren laugh at something one of the board members said, watching Nate try again to get a word in and get talked over a second time, watching Priya keep the conversation safely on corn and potato salad. Nobody at that barbecue had what I had. Not the standing to ask the right questions without it looking like an accusation, and not the 14 years of knowing exactly which document tells the truth when the summary is built to hide it. I didn't say any of that out loud. I didn't need to announce a single thing to Nate, to Priya, to anyone standing near that cooler. I just knew, quietly and completely, that I was the only person at that barbecue who could actually find out what had really happened to my husband's signature. That conversation by the cooler is exactly the thread I pulled the next morning, using the one tool I actually had. Monday morning, I did the one thing I actually knew how to do properly. I didn't call the underwriting carrier as Warren's daughter-in-law with a bad feeling. I called as an interested party, Nate's spouse, with a documented stake in the outcome of a claim touching property he partly owned, and requested a certified copy of the ownership transfer authorization on file through the same carrier-to-carrier verification channel I use a dozen times a month for my own casework. Nothing about the request was improper. Nothing about it required me to open a file that wasn't, in some real sense, already mine to ask about. The certified copy arrived by secure email 2 days later, and it matched the photograph on my phone, exactly same tight closed loop on the K, where Nate's real signature always opens, same date, same language about financial hardship. But this copy carried something the courier packet hadn't shown me. A notary seal, pressed into the corner of the page, with a name and commission number printed beneath it. Denise Farrow. Warren's executive assistant for 11 years. The woman who orders his lunch, keeps his calendar, and has sat 2 feet from his office door longer than I've been part of this family. I'd had no idea she was even a licensed notary. I sat with that for a while before I opened the second document the carrier sent, an itemized loss schedule, the kind that lays out, line by line, exactly what a fire is worth on paper. Equipment. Inventory. Structural damage to the Northeast Bay. The total came to $840,000. What stopped me wasn't the number. It was the date stamped at the top of the ownership transfer authorization, sitting right beside the date stamped on the claim filing itself. The transfer was dated 3 days before the fire claim was ever filed. Warren had told the whole family the ownership restructuring happened afterward, a practical adjustment, he'd said, in light of the loss, nothing more than sound business sense following an unfortunate accident. But an authorization signed 3 days before a claim exists isn't a reaction to hardship. It's preparation for one. Someone had moved Nate's stake out of the way before the insurance money ever came into the picture, not after, which meant the fire hadn't caused the restructuring at all. It had followed it. I sat at my kitchen table with both documents open in front of me, the same table where I'd first found that wrong-shaped case 7 months earlier, and understood I was no longer looking at a family being careless with each other. A forged signature is one document. A notary who happened to work down the hall from the man who needed the forgery is a pattern starting to take shape. And a transfer dated 3 days ahead of a fire claim isn't a coincidence anybody could explain away with a shrug and a change of subject. Proving the date was suspicious was one thing. Proving, in a way that would hold up to anyone who wanted to argue otherwise, that my husband had never signed that page at all, that was a different task altogether, and it meant I couldn't do this alone anymore. I called Renata Alvarez the following week. Renata and I have sat across from each other in 3 separate claims disputes over the years, on opposite sides of the table each time, and she beat me fairly. Once found a coverage gap in a business interruption claim I'd flagged that I genuinely hadn't seen coming. I've trusted her ever since precisely because of that loss. Anyone who beats you clean, without cutting a corner to do it, is someone worth calling when you need the truth more than you need to be right. I laid the 2 documents out on her conference table and told her everything, plainly, the way I'd want a claimant to tell it to me. Renata went quiet for a moment, the specific quiet of someone recalculating what kind of problem she's actually looking at. This isn't a family disagreement anymore, she said. A backdated ownership transfer tied to an insurance claim, with a forged signature and a notary seal from someone employed by the very man who benefits, that's potential insurance fraud. It's notarial misconduct on top of it, and both carry real exposure. For Warren. For Ms. Farrow. I asked her what I needed to make it undeniable. She told me I needed genuine signature samples from Nate, several of them, ordinary and unremarkable, nothing staged, so a certified document examiner could compare stroke pressure, letter formation, and spacing against the transfer signature, with no room left for argument. I got them without telling Nate why. I asked him to sign 3 delivery confirmations for a work thing, the kind of small boring request a marriage runs on without anyone questioning it, and he signed all 3 at the kitchen counter without looking up from his phone. I gave copies to Renata, who forwarded them to an examiner she'd used in prior cases, someone with no connection to our family, and no reason to find anything except what the ink actually showed. The report came back 9 days later. The transfer signature and Nate's 3 genuine samples were not a match, at a confidence level the examiner described, in his own careful language, as conclusive. While all of that moved quietly forward, Warren was consumed with planning his and Elaine's 30th anniversary dinner at the Brindlewood Country Club, the seating chart, the band, whether the salmon or the beef tenderloin photographed better on the club sample menu. He called Nate one evening while I was in the next room, close enough to hear most of it, and told him, with real warmth in his voice, that Mara finally seemed to be settling into her role in this family. I remember exactly where I was standing when I heard that. I didn't move. I didn't say anything to Nate about it that night, or any night after. I asked Renata to hold the certified findings, the authenticated report, the notary records, the law schedule, all of it bound and sealed, until I gave her a specific date. Not sooner. I didn't want this arriving on some ordinary Tuesday where it would sit in a drawer, while Warren found some new way to explain it away in private, one relative at a time. I wanted it in a room he couldn't leave and couldn't spin, in front of the exact people whose good opinion he'd spent his whole life building. I gave her one date. The morning of the anniversary dinner. That envelope arrived exactly on schedule, delivered to my door the same morning the whole family was getting dressed for a party that was about to go very differently than anyone at the Brindlewood Country Club had planned for. The ballroom at Brindlewood filled the way it always does for Warren with the exact people whose opinion he's spent 30 years cultivating. His golf partners took the round table nearest the band. 2 of Kessler Fabrications board members arrived together, already talking shop before they'd even found their seats. Elaine's sister flew in from Ohio for the occasion. And near the head table, close enough to the toasts and the cake, sat Denise Farrow, introduced to anyone who asked as a trusted family friend. I watched Warren duck into the men's room 20 minutes before dinner and catch a glimpse of him through the door before it swung shut, practicing something in the mirror, his mouth moving over words I couldn't hear, one hand lifted like it already held a glass. He'd been rehearsing that toast for days. I knew, because Elaine had mentioned it twice that week, proud of him for it, the way you'd be proud of a man preparing something thoughtful instead of something aimed. At the bar, Denise ordered a club soda and found somewhere else to look every time I came near, studying the ice sculpture, the band setting up, anything that wasn't my face. I said hello anyway. She said it back too quickly and moved off toward her table. Nate sat beside me through the cocktail hour, refolding his napkin into a triangle, then flat again, then a triangle again, 4 times before the appetizers even reached our table. He didn't know what was coming. Only I did. I put my hand over his once, just briefly, and he stopped for a moment, then started again without noticing he had. Every family has one person who keeps the peace by staying quiet even when they already know something is wrong. Comment below who that person is in yours, because in my family, for years, that person was me, the one who cleared the plates, who changed the subject, who let the wrong version of events stand, because saying otherwise always cost more than it was worth. I'd built my whole marriage into this family around that quiet. I was about to find out what it felt like to finally put it down. The band eased into something soft as the servers cleared the salad plates. Warren stood at the head table, tapped the side of his glass twice with a fork, and the room settled the way rooms do for a man who has never once had to ask twice for attention. 30 years, he said, looking out over all of it, the board members, his golf partners. Elaine's sister dabbing her eyes already. 30 years, and I want to say something about the people who matter in this family. His eyes moved down the table, past Nate, and landed, finally, on me. She married him for the money, not the man, Warren said. His golf partners laughed, quick and easy, the kind of laugh that comes from men who have never had to think twice about what they say out loud. Elaine went still beside him, her fork resting against her plate, her eyes fixed somewhere past my shoulder. I set my wine glass down. No clink. No sound at all. Since we're talking about money, I said, I actually had some questions about the warehouse claim. $840,000, if I remember the figure correctly. Warren's smile held for a moment, the way a held note does right before it breaks. This isn't the time, Mara. It's exactly the time, I said, and reached into my bag for the envelope Renata had couriered that morning. I didn't throw anything. I laid each page down beside a champagne flute, one at a time, the way you'd lay out evidence for someone who still had a chance to understand it calmly, if he chose to. The certified copy of the ownership transfer authorization. The notary seal in the corner. The itemized law schedule with the total circled in red ink that wasn't mine, Renata's, from her own review. The signature examiner's report, bound, with his findings printed in plain, careful language on the final page. "The money I supposedly married for," I said, "is the same money you forged my husband's signature to steal. And I have the claim file to prove it, Warren." Nobody at that table laughed this time. I kept my voice level, the same voice I use across a desk from a claimant who's about to hear something they don't want to hear. I told them what the ownership transfer authorization actually showed, that it released Nate's minority stake in the warehouse property to Warren, dated 3 full days before the fire claim was ever filed, which meant the restructuring hadn't followed the fire at all. It had come first. I told them the signature on that page didn't match a single genuine sample Nate had ever produced, according to a certified document examiner, with no connection to this family, and nothing to gain from the finding either way. And I told them whose name sat on the notary seal authenticating a signature that was never real. I looked, for the first time all evening, at Denise. Her face had gone the color of the tablecloth. She didn't reach for her water glass. She didn't reach for anything. She just sat very still, the way you sit when you've spent years believing a thing would never come back around to you, and it finally has, in a room full of people who know your name. Nate picked up the transfer document with 2 fingers, like it might do something if he held it wrong. He'd never seen his own forged signature before that moment. I watched him read it, the tight closed loop on the K, so close to his own hand and so completely wrong, and I watched something in his face settle into a stillness I'd never seen on him before, not anger yet, just the specific quiet of a man realizing his own name had been used against him without his knowledge. Warren reached for the papers like he might simply gather them up and end this the way he ended every uncomfortable conversation in this family, by deciding it was over. I didn't stop him. I didn't need to. The 2 board members at the next table over had already leaned toward each other, heads close, one of them murmuring something, the other answered with a slow, deliberate nod. They exchanged a look, brief, unhurried, the kind 2 men give each other when they've just quietly recalculated everything they thought they understood about the person signing their paychecks. Warren saw it. I watched him see it, watched the exact half-second his face stopped matching the room he thought he still controlled. That look between the 2 of them didn't stay contained for long. "This is a family matter," Warren said, his voice climbing. "Not a boardroom." "It stopped being a family matter 3 days before the fire," I said, and left it there. He turned toward Denise instead, some old reflex kicking in, the instinct of a man who spent 30 years believing a problem could be managed if he simply directed it at someone lower on the org chart. "Denise, tell them this is a misunderstanding. Explain the notary stamp." Denise didn't answer right away. 11 years sitting 2 feet from his office door, 11 years of ordering his lunch and guarding his calendar, and I watched all of it settle into something new on her face, the specific arithmetic of a woman, realizing she was about to be the one left holding this alone. "You told me to notarize it," she said quietly, to the tablecloth more than to him. "You told me Nate had already signed it and just needed it certified. He wasn't in the room." One of the board members stood, folded his napkin once, and set it beside a dessert he hadn't touched. "I'll need to speak with you first thing Monday, Warren," he said, and walked out without waiting for a response, his colleague close behind him. Elaine, who I had watched defend her husband through 30 years of dinners just like this one, turned to Denise instead of to Warren. "Is that true?" Denise nodded, once, and didn't look up. Priya pushed back her chair without a word and walked toward the patio doors, one hand pressed flat against her stomach, the way you'd hold yourself together after news that wasn't a surprise so much as a confirmation of something you'd suspected and hoped, against your better judgment, wasn't true. Nate hadn't moved. He sat with the transfer document still in his hands, staring at the signature that wore his name and wasn't his, and he said nothing at all, not to his father, not to me, not to the room. I've heard Nate raise his voice exactly twice in 9 years of marriage. This silence was heavier than either of those times combined. I didn't say anything else. I didn't need the last word, and reaching for one would have made this about winning, instead of about what was simply, finally, true. I gathered the pages back into their folder, squared the edges the way I do at the end of every closed file, and set it in my lap. The maitre d' had already crossed the room to speak low into the ear of the club's event manager, who came to the head table a moment later, with the particular calm of someone trained for exactly this kind of evening. "Mr. Kessler," he said, "why don't we step outside for a moment? Get some air." Warren looked, for the first time all night, like a man being asked rather than doing the asking. He stood, smoothed the front of his jacket out of pure habit, and let the event manager guide him toward the door, past his golf partners, who had gone very quiet, past the board members' empty table, past Denise, who still hadn't looked up. By the time I stood to leave, the valet had already brought my car around, engine idling at the curb exactly where I'd known, somehow, it would be. My purse was already on the passenger seat. Nate followed me out a few minutes later, the folder in his own hands now, and neither of us said much on the drive home, not because there was nothing left to say, but because the real reckoning wasn't going to happen in a parking lot. It was going to happen in the weeks that came after, once the dinner and the dessert and the whole performance of that anniversary were finally behind us. Within 2 weeks, the underwriting carrier opened a formal fraud referral on the warehouse claim, citing the certified signature analysis and the backdated transfer as grounds for investigation. Kessler Fabrications Board suspended Warren's signing authority pending an internal review. The same 2 board members who'd left dessert untouched, now overseeing exactly the kind of scrutiny Warren had spent his career applying to everyone else. Denise resigned before the board could act on her directly, rather than face the notarial misconduct complaint Renata helped Nate file with the state licensing office. I never heard from her again. I didn't expect to. Nate's ownership stake was restored within the month through the same certified findings that had sat on that head table 3 weeks earlier: the examiner's report, the notary records, all of it doing exactly the quiet, unglamorous work good documentation is supposed to do. For the first time in 3 years, we had real footing under us. Not luck. Not a rescue. Just the truth, finally recognized as evidence instead of dismissed as an inconvenience. Elaine called me on a Tuesday evening, 10 days after the dinner. Not to apologize for Warren, I don't think, even now, she believes that's hers to give on his behalf. She told me she was filing for a legal separation after 32 years, her voice steadier than I expected, and asked me, plainly, how bad the fraud referral might get for the family's finances going forward. I answered her the way I'd answer anyone asking a fair question about a process I understood better than most people in her position ever would, without warmth, but without cruelty either. She thanked me before she hung up, and I believed she meant it. Priya and I started meeting for coffee, twice that first month alone, more time than the 2 of us had spent together in the previous 3 years combined. We didn't talk much about her father. Mostly we talked about her job, her plans, the ordinary texture of a life neither of us had made much room for before. I found I liked her more once neither of us had to keep changing the subject at every meal. Esteban Ruiz kept his job on the warehouse floor and his pension along with it. His name never appeared in a single filing, in any complaint, in any document Renata submitted on Nate's behalf. I made certain of that myself, the same way I'd make certain of it for any source who trusted me with something that could have cost him everything if it got traced back. Warren never called. Not that week, not the month after. I heard, secondhand through Nate, that he'd moved into a rental near the club, that he still golfed on Saturdays with the same partners who'd laughed at his toast, though I wondered how much longer that particular friendship would hold once the fraud referral worked its way through the papers those men actually read. It wasn't the dinner that taught me anything, in the end. Not the folder, not the look between the board members, not even the valet bringing my car around exactly on schedule. It was the ordinary weeks after the Tuesday phone calls, the coffee with Priya, the quiet return of a job and a paycheck that were finally, legally, ours, where the real shape of what had happened settled all the way into place. For a long time, I thought composure meant absorbing whatever the family decided to hand me: the comments about real money, the toasts that looked past me, the ledger nobody ever let me see the entries of. I thought staying quiet was the price of staying in the room. I understand it differently now. Composure was never about absorbing anything. It was the discipline of waiting until the truth could hold its own weight, without me having to raise my voice to prop it up. Being the strong one was never the same as being believed. I had to prove that on paper, the same way I would for any stranger's claim crossing my desk, before my own family would finally hear a word of it. Nate and I bought a modest house last spring, nothing grand, just enough rooms for the life we're actually building instead of the one we kept waiting to be handed. Both our names are on the deed. I still notice that, some mornings, more than I probably should, 2 names, side by side, exactly where they belong. Elaine calls most Sundays now. Carefully, at first, like someone testing whether a habit will hold if she leans on it. It's becoming something real between us, slowly, in the way things actually become real, not through one grand gesture, but through a dozen small ones that keep showing up on schedule. If you've ever had to build your own case just to be believed by the people who were supposed to believe you first, no documents, no envelope, just the plain fact of what happened to you, tell me about it in the comments. I read every one. And if this story felt like your family, even a little, hit subscribe, because next time I'm telling you what happened when my sister-in-law found her own envelope waiting on her doorstep and what she decided to do with it once she opened it.